Well, that was our very dear friend Tom Mathias, whom we lost about a year and a half ago, talking right here at the bridge about building these massive red banners, the things that we take for granted that it takes to put this worship service on. And I'm going to talk about Tom again in just a little bit, but I thought that clip was very powerful. When I was growing up, Memorial Day was always one of those days that confused me just a little bit. Back then, people still had paper instead of iPads. And I remember being a little fourth grader, and you got this homework calendar with a binder clip that you could mark the day every day. And I remember the first thing I did when I got that homework calendar was to flip through and find all the holidays and highlight them so I could know exactly when we were going to be out of school. And there were a lot of days I didn't even know what they meant. Boxing Day, Labor Day, I didn't know what that was for. Memorial Day observed, I don't know why it's always in parentheses. But when you're 10, you don't really question why you get a day off of school. And I've learned since then that when you're an adult, you don't really question why you get a day off of work either. But of course, as a child, and perhaps even now, Memorial Day usually means the beginning of the summer for most of us. We think pool parties, we think hot dogs and cookouts, and working on the first of our summer tan. And I don't think that anybody should feel bad about taking a day of rest. In fact, I think that God encourages us to do that from time to time. If you've got plans to go out on the lake tomorrow, who's going on the lake tomorrow, or pool, or hanging out? All right, so some water people over here. So for those of you who are going out on the lake tomorrow, you're in good company, and you will love Mark 6:32, where Jesus takes his disciples and they go away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves. This was kind of a first Memorial Day. So Jesus sets this example for us, and being a Christian is hard work. Not to make light of that, but once in a while, being a Christian has its perks too. So I encourage you all to take a day of rest tomorrow if you can. God knows that we need rest, which is why only one of the 10 commandments that he gave us is to remember a day every week, to set it aside, to rest, to praise God, and just to find goodness in your life. So I've come to appreciate these really collective days off as a society from our busy lives. But on the other hand, we know that Memorial Day is not just a day off. It's not just a day of rest. At its core, Memorial Day is really about honoring the opposite of that. It's about lifting up those who gave their own life to make the lives of other people better. Now, my grandfather on my mom's side fought in World War II, and he made sure that we never took Memorial Day for granted. Each year when we were little, he'd take us to the cemetery to put flowers and flags at the graveside of some of his friends that he had lost in the war. Now, I am a proponent of what you all know as the separation of church and state. And in fact, I think for the most part, when the government gets involved in putting the 10 Commandments in courthouses and classrooms, that it tends to drive people away from our religion rather than towards it. So I think that it's a good thing and that it's a blessing that we can separate out those two things. But there is something about Memorial Day that strikes a chord with me in worship tonight. The Bible talks about these kind of sacrifices, saying that no one has greater love than to lay one's life down for one's friends. So I don't think we can just brush over this day and pretend like it's any other. And in fact, I can't help but think that perhaps this same message should ring true for us every single Sunday, not just one weekend of the year, but every Sunday. It's what we're really about. That we gather here to remember to praise the one who sacrificed his life for us so that we can live freely, that we can live fully. That's what church is about. But tonight, though, I don't want to just lift up the people in the military who gave their lives for us. That's not what this worship service is all about. So I want you to stop for a moment from this message and to think about all those people who got you to where you are today. Think about those people who have sacrificed for you, parents or grandparents, teachers, all those people who have given up something so that you can be the way that you are. And I want you to keep those people in mind for the next few moments. today we lift up those people who are no longer with us. Perhaps some of them we do honor who died overseas in harm's way. And there are others that we honor tonight who simply lived lives of quiet grace in our own communities. All of those people have made us who we are. Because just as life wouldn't be who we are without the sacrifices of those who came before us, in the same way, our church wouldn't be the same without those pillars who came before us. Now, I'm not just talking about martyrs, people from the 2nd and 3rd century. I'm not talking about theologians from the Renaissance for a long time today. I'm talking about even the people who made tonight possible, that we can sit in this exact room and worship God the way that we do. A moment ago, we saw this video of Tom Matthias. And if you didn't have the privilege of meeting Tom, he was an 85-year-old member of this church who passed away a little bit over a year ago. And Tom loved traditional worship services. That was his thing, to be upstairs in the sanctuary. But he cared so much about the future of the church that he helped build everything in this room, from the stage that I'm standing on right now to these crazy red banners that fly in overhead every week. Tom knew that this service was not for him. He knew that he wasn't going to come to this service every week, but he wanted to be a part of building it because he knew that his efforts could make a difference in somebody's life at some point. So if you've been reached by this service, you've been reached by Tom Matthias, even if you didn't meet him. He knew that just as God had been faithful to his generation, that God would be faithful to the next generation as well, and he wanted to be a part of that, of showing us that. So he spent his retirement years with a hammer, with a bucket of paint, walking down these halls and making sure everything was perfect so that we could enjoy this place as he and his children had. Now, Tom, much like my patriotic grandfather, was part of what they rightfully call the greatest generation. They were the ones who, as you know, survived the Depression, who put an end to the Holocaust, and our world would literally not be the same without these people who came before us. But at the same time, I don't think that, at least in God's eyes, that our greatness, so to speak, is measured by the things that we've already done. I think that in God's eyes, our greatness can be measured by the potential for what we have yet to do in this world. You see, the ones who came before us may be called the greatest generation, but Psalm 100 tells us that God's faithfulness extends to all generations. It says that we are his people, the sheep of his pasture, and that we should forever enter his courts with thanksgiving, his gates with praise. Now, you may have heard these words before, but don't take them for granted. If we put it another way, just as God was faithful to the generations that came before us, God will be faithful to our generation and faithful to all the generations after us too. That God will see us through whatever it is that we face today. My brother recently shared an old Cherokee proverb that I really liked. It says, "When you were born, you cried, and the world rejoiced. Live your life so that when you die, the world cries and you rejoice." Think about that. Few places on this earth hold more tears on a regular basis than funeral homes. But when we live our life in a way that shows God's faithfulness to other people, not as a concept that we read about in the Bible, not as a concept that's out there in some other world, but when we live our lives in a way that shows people God's faithfulness to us, after the tears come in those moments, there always comes a smile next. You might remember the story of Mary and Martha who run to the tomb after Jesus dies, and they're full of tears. But in that moment, when they're sitting there at the tomb, they feel God's faithfulness, and they leave full, not of tears, but full of hope. how God's faithfulness works in our lives. I've wondered here before, if our generation, the ones of us sitting in this room tonight, had been around in the year 30 AD, would Jesus still have died? Imagine if it were us back then, hanging out with Jesus in those days leading up to his arrest, to his betrayal. If we were the ones hanging out with Jesus, would he have died? Imagine instead if Jesus had just come to the world and for many, many decades taught us his wisdom, let us learn from him, and then at last, dying of old age, he says with a half smile, I think you're starting to get it. But we know that's not what happened. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that's not what would have happened either if we were around back then. But the point is that instead of being with Jesus, instead of hanging out with Jesus and giving us his best shot, all we get to do is to remember. All we get to do is to remember. So we're left trying to do our best to remember his sacrifice for us 2,000 years later. But it's important for us to note that when we remember something, it's not the same thing as when we recall something. It doesn't mean just to bring a memory back and to remember it in that sense of the word. But to remember, to remember, means to take some member of your community, to take some part of your community, and to bring that member back together with who we are now. To be joined with somebody from your community one more time, to remember. So maybe we could say it like this: the best way to remember someone is to live with the spirit that they lived with. To bring them back into our community, even after they're gone, but to remember them into our community by living the way that they lived. It's the same reason that my grandfather always tells us that we should be more patriotic on Memorial Day. Because for those who died, they were more grateful for their country. And when we live with their same spirit, we are remembering them back into our community. But I promise you that this sermon would separate church and state and respect those boundaries. So that's not my point. I use that as an example for us to say that because the best way to remember Jesus is to live with the same spirit that Jesus lived with. To remember Jesus is to bring him back to this earth for the people we encounter, to bring Jesus back to this earth by living our lives the way that he lived. That is Christianity in a nutshell. It's not simply recalling that Jesus died, but it is remembering Christ into our communities by living our lives in a way that reflects his life. I'd like to close tonight with a special prayer for those people that we would like to remember. Many of you have lost people that you love in the last year. We've lost people from our church family over the last year. So I'd like to close tonight by lifting up some of those people and inviting you to remember them into our community with a prayer. So will you join me in prayer as we lift up these people that we've lost? Let us all pray together for Catherine Borchelt, for Georgia Cooper, for Jeff Dyer, for Ann Edenfield, for Jim Fleming, for Gary Lynn, for Rosalie Mitchell, for Minnie Peak, for James Rivas, for T. Reese, for for Mark Richardson Jr., for Martha Schwartz, for Brian Stanley, for Red Warnock, Caroline Williams, for all those who have lost their lives in tragedy, for all those people that we have known and loved, and for those that we had never met. We commend them into God's Spirit tonight.